You know, Terraria has what, like 33 bosses, but it could always use more, and I've personally felt that the dungeon could especially use one. After all, the Jungle Temple got a boss, and the dungeon has way more content than that. And no, Skeletron and the Lunatic Cultists don't count. They're not fought in the dungeon biome, they're just found at the entrance. And also no, the Dungeon Guardian is not a boss, it's just a really tough enemy. But what if it was a boss? What if the Dungeon Guardian was a full-on boss fight that had to be fought within the confines of the dungeon? That, dear viewer, is the premise for today's video. But before we get into things, if you haven't heard, 100% of my viewers are subscribed. So if you're watching this video and you aren't subscribed, then you don't exist. And now, since I don't have an original bone in my body, I started by taking the Dungeon Guardian sprite and spray painting it blue. A little programming later, enter the Ecto Guardian. Now, you may ask, what is special about the Ecto Guardian? Well, I'm here to tell you that it is much slower and weaker than its predecessor. Now you may be thinking, isn't that kind of boring? Well, unlike with the Dungeon Guardian, you have to fight the Ecto Guardian within the confines of the dungeon. If at any point during the fight you are not in the dungeon biome, the boss will immediately despawn. And you know how most bosses take up a lot of NPC slots so that other enemies are unlikely to spawn while you're fighting them? Well, the Ecto Guardian doesn't do that, so you're going to have to deal with full unrestricted dungeon enemy spawns during the fight. But you may be thinking, it's still pretty boring, it needs to do something more. I thought so, which is why I made it occasionally spawn these Ecto Maces. What is an ectomace, you ask? Let me educate you. At first glance, they may appear to act like the normal spike ball enemy that sometimes spawns in the dungeon, which is true, but they do have some special attributes. For one, they don't take up any NPC slots, so they won't be restricting dungeon spawns. More notably, they never despawn, so they'll be there until the end of the fight. They also have a way of following you. If you run away, they'll always move so that they're just a little bit off screen. Once they're on screen again, they'll start slowly moving back to their starting location. This means that they can actually be a problem for you even if you're not near the place where they spawned. Oh, and did I mention that they also apply the curse debuff if they touch you? The Ecto Guardian is going to be spawning one of these Ectomaces roughly every 4 seconds, and since there's no limit to how many there can be, the dungeon will slowly fill up with them. Now the fight is a race against time to kill the Ecto Guardian before you get cornered or forced to loop back on yourself, because as soon as you go through a path that you've already been through, you're going to get absolutely swarmed by these curse-applying Ectomaces. And of course, if you try to loop it in the same small area for the entire fight, that's not going to end well for you. Defeating the Ecto Guardian takes careful planning and preparation to ensure that you can use as much space as possible in the dungeon without getting cornered. Chances are that if you just tried to fight it in an untouched dungeon, you'd lose. And speaking of trying to fight it, you may be wondering, how do you encounter this boss? Well, there are 2 ways. The first way is to encounter it by chance. If you haven't killed the Ecto Guardian before in this world, it has a small chance to spawn in the dungeon biome. But if you don't feel like waiting around, you can summon the boss using a cursed dungeon key, which can be crafted at a demon altar using a golden key and 50 bones. Now, there's still something missing. Any decent, self-respecting boss has an expert mode changed to its AI. I'm looking at you, Moon Lord. So in normal mode, when you kill the boss, it just dies and drops its loot. But in expert mode, I gave it a sort of second form. It's pretty simple, so I'm just gonna show you a clip of what happens. So that was something, and of course, when you kill all the crazy ectomaces, you get awarded with the boss's loot. And speaking of loot, I have made 2 weapons for the boss to drop so far. One is a mace that kind of swings around you in a wide circle, maybe a little bit overpowered, and a spell tome that can shoot through walls, also a bit overpowered. Obviously, it's going to need to drop more weapons than just that, but I haven't thought of anything yet. I also haven't thought of any ideas for an expert mode drop. So, if you have any ideas, feel free to let me know in the comments section. And that pretty much wraps up this video. This has been the first boss I've ever made for modded Terraria, and honestly, I'm pretty happy with it. Yes, it is a blatant Dungeon Guardian knockoff, but it's a good blatant Dungeon Guardian knockoff. And it's infinitely better than the first boss I made for Starbound. Of course, I can't claim all the credit for myself. I'd like to give a big thank you to the folks on the Team Onloader server for answering all my stupid questions. Probably would have never gotten this done otherwise. And for those of you who for some reason would like to fight this boss, well, I'm sorry, you can't, and you won't be able to for a long time. I'm not going to release this mod until I've made all the other bosses that I want to add to the game, but I'll keep you posted. Oh, and don't forget to like and subscribe to prove that you exist. Thank you, goodbye.